Good morning, everybody. It is Thursday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined today by sports columnist Paul Zeise for our weekly Zeise is Right video. How are you, Paul?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well as well. I just want to get into we're recording here on Thursday morning, the final day of Steelers training camp. So I want to get into some topics here of where we stand as we pivot completely from training camp into what is the preseason, which is still about 3 weeks long. And the number one topic I wanted to talk to you about, Paul, was the running backs. Ray Fittipaldo in his latest 53-man roster projection, our great Steelers insider, projects only Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren are going to make this roster at running back, and that they may stash Anthony McFarland and some other guys on the expanded practice squads. Paul, my question for you is how you feel about that, given that this team is predicated on the running game, and injuries happen at that position. Paul, are you concerned that if Najee Harris or Jaylen Warren goes down, that this running offense that we've been talking about is suddenly going to be pretty precariously thin, because the only real safety net you possibly have is Connor Hayward, who I think is really more of a pass catching and blocking guy at this point than a runner, as your, basically your number 3 running back. Do you have any concern about that?
Well, I would say the question is, why would they only keep 2? It doesn't seem like it's enough. I mean, running backs are players that, and I read Ray's piece, and I read where he said basically that Anthony McFarland doesn't have a lot of special teams value. But to me, I can't imagine going into the season with only 2 running backs in today's NFL. All the different ways you use players. Now, if you're telling me that they're going to stash one of them on their practice squad and he's going to be able to clear waivers and everything, and so you have him at your disposal as an emergency player if you need him, maybe I feel a little bit differently than that. But Adam, usually running backs are like the most versatile players you have on your team. So I have a hard time believing that they can't figure out something for Anthony McFarland to do on special teams, where he could become a valuable player in a lot of other ways. Also, I think Anthony McFarland is kind of a different skill set than the other 2 guys. So I hate it. I'll be honest with you. I don't think Anthony McFarland is all-world player, but I think he has value. And I think that if you basically only keep 2 running backs and they essentially do the same thing, you're announcing to the world exactly the way that you're going to play every single week, and you're announcing to the world that your running game is going to be basically north-south. And I understand that they throw in some jet sweeps, and I'm sure they'll use Calvin Austin here and there and whatnot and all that other stuff. But at the end of the day, they don't have a running back that they can really hand the ball to that's going to take it to the house other than McFarland. And that's not to say that he, he's going to do it all the time, but it just seems weird to me when you've got a running back who's got a completely different skill set than the other guys that you would cut him. Hope that he clears and then put him on your practice squad. I just don't know that that's going to be the best course of action, if you ask me.
Well, you mentioned the jet sweeps and stuff. I'm willing to entertain that if you had a Deebo Samuel character on this roster, right, that maybe 2 is enough, and then maybe you have enough different threats in the running game, and maybe Calvin Austin or maybe, I don't know, Chase Claypool's not on the roster anymore, but one of the other receivers can step up and prove to be kind of, an option in the running game. But until I see that happen, Paul, I'm with you. I think 2 is not enough. I don't think it diversifies you enough in terms of your threats. And, I think it leaves you vulnerable to an injury. Do we really want to see Jaylen Warren getting 30 carries in a game if Najee Harris gets injured early? Is Jaylen Warren made for that? I don't know that we know that yet.
Right. And the other part of it is, if you look at traditionally what teams do with running backs, I mean, you can use running backs in a lot of different capacities, especially a guy like Anthony McFarland. So I agree. I mean, here's the other thing, Jaylen Warren, what if Najee goes down, is Jaylen Warren ready to run the ball 25 times a game? I don't know. I don't know. We saw some bits and pieces from him last year that we liked. But I'm just when I read this from Ray, and believe me, I don't ever doubt Ray. But when I read this from Ray, I said, "Boy, that is really, really a gamble. If they're actually going to go with only 2 running backs, that is really rolling the dice in my mind."
Yeah, I think I think it's predicated on, are you going to be able to keep Anthony McFarland on the practice squad? But to your point, I think you still want to have the threat of his speed in the backfield. But if that's the vibe Ray is getting, I certainly trust the intel and whatever gut feeling he's getting in terms of what they want to do. I just don't know that I completely agree that it's the right thing to do. Paul, let's get into some other topics here. I wanted to talk about Joey Porter Jr. and Broderick Jones here at the end of training camp. Are you surprised with the fact that they have not yet seized these starting roles, or at least started to whittle away to the point that you can now see them winning the job by week 1? Because I don't think that it's a certainty that either one is going to be a starter by week 1. I think Dan Moore and Levi Wallace have proven to be tougher outs than people expected. My question for you, Paul, is that a good thing? Does that show some depth that this team has? And especially in the case of cornerback, I think you'd rather have more good cornerbacks than not. So if you got 3 guys that can work in that secondary, I think that's a good sign. But how do you feel about where they stand? Are you worried at all that they haven't kind of really seized that mantle yet?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but Joey Porter has been, battling some, minor type injuries, and so he's sort of been slowed a little bit by that. And you know what? If you're a veteran, you can get away with missing practices and missing reps and everything else. But when you're a rookie, man, every one of those reps really matters. And if you miss some of them because you're banged up or you beat up a little bit or whatever, the case is with him, it isn't a surprise. I would say I really believe that he will be a starter at some point this season, probably and probably almost from the start. But I like the fact that Mike Tomlin has made both of these guys earn their job, and hasn't just handed them their job. That's the important thing to me. I think that Broderick Jones is going to be the starter. I think Joey Porter is going to be the starter, right? I do. But I also think that when you look at it, if you just hand them the job and they don't have to work for it a little bit, I don't know that you're necessarily going to get to a point where maybe they're going to be a little bit entitled, or maybe they won't have a little bit of an edge that they need. There's a lot of reasons why coaches do that. Joey Porter is going to get the play. I mean, they're going to use a lot of corners. They're going to use 3 corners in a lot of formations, right? So it could be a situation where Patrick Peterson moves to the slot, and the next thing you know, Porter gets to play a lot, and they're all in there. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't worry as much about him. I think he's going to be a starter anyway. But I think also, even if he's not a starter, he's going to play a lot, right? And eventually become a starter. Broderick Jones at left tackle. There's only one guy that plays left tackle, Adam. They don't rotate. It's not like, first base. It's not like a first base platoon or something, right? In baseball, it's not like a position like linebacker where they can play 5 of them at a time. They can play 2 of them at a time. They can play, depending on the sub package. Same thing with safety, right? Receivers, they can play 2 to 4 if they need to, right? It's not like it's one of those positions. There's one guy that plays. That's it. So I think if you read the tea leaves, it feels like they're starting to now have a little bit more glowing reports about Broderick Jones, and they're starting to see him get a few more reps here and there. So it could be that they're just feeding him into the system. But if we get to next Friday, which would mean the final exhibition game has been played, and Broderick Jones is still a 2 on the depth chart, I don't know if that's a good sign, because it means at least for the first part of the season, he's going to be on the bench. And I'm sorry, but if you move up to go get a guy, they needed to make sure it was going to be an impact player for this year. So Jones, I'm a little bit more hesitant to be like, oh, well, it'll be okay. They're just trying to make him earn his job. I actually think that he's got a problem in that Dan Moore has played really well, which is a good thing for the Steelers, but it also creates a headache because now you've got this guy you traded up to get in the draft sitting around, as your third swing tackle or whatever you want to call him. I don't know if that's a good thing. I think he's a guy that needs to play and needs to be out there on the field. So if Dan Moore continues to be the starter, it's good for Dan Moore and maybe it's good for the Steelers. But by the same token, it makes you wonder, did they pick the right guy in the draft?
Yeah, I guess the one caveat I'd give Paul is, I think if you start seeing him week 5, week 6, somewhere around there, somewhere around the bye, I think that's probably okay. But given the pass rushers that they face at the top of the schedule here, Nick Bosa, Max Crosby, like, do you really want to see Broderick Jones thrown into the deep end against those guys and maybe lose some confidence, or do you want to say, hey, maybe he replaces Dan Moore after you've dealt with some of those guys? I still think that that's not the worst outcome in the world, but I think it's also concerning given that just what you said, they traded up to get this guy. Usually when you do that, you're supposed to be talking about a ready-made prospect.
What if Dan Moore plays really well against Joey Bosa and company?
That's also true.
Then
you
what?
have a problem.
Then what? So. I mean, again, I think Broderick Jones, I like the pick when it happened, but one of the things I said prior to the draft is with those first 3 picks, they need to get guys who are going to impact the team this year. Joey Porter will. It looks like the second round pick. What was his name? The Keanu Benton.
Keanu Benton. Yes.
Keanu Benton. Looks like he's going to have an impact. If we just got to see what happens with Jones, but I expected by this point in camp that Jones would be the starter.
Paul, I also wanted to get into a couple of odds and ends here. We can hit these ones quickly. Ryan Clark saying that he believes Justin Jefferson or George Pickens is better than Justin Jefferson or has more talent. I believe he said more talent. Whether George Pickens can use that talent, I guess, is more of an open question, but what do you think of that quickly? Do you think it's true? Do you think we could see George Pickens threatening that territory this year?
I mean, again, Ryan Clark's a hot take guy, and that's what he does, and I'm glad he did it. I don't know how you measure that. If he's saying that he has more talent than Justin Jefferson, okay. I mean, I guess so. I'm not a talent evaluator. It looks like if he's saying he's a better player than Justin Jefferson, well, I can't go there yet. I mean, I've got to see a hell of a lot more before I declare that he's a better player than Justin Jefferson. I would just say with George Pickens, I expect him to have a pretty good year. I think he'll do some good things for the Steelers. He's obviously going to sort of mature and become more than just the guy that makes all the big acrobatic catches. I thought the catch for a touchdown and run that he had against Tampa the other night, that's the kind of play that's sort of a routine play in many ways that, if he starts making that play all the time to go along with all the crazy stuff that he does, yeah, I mean, then you're talking about a legitimate superstar, but I would pump the brakes a little bit right now on expectations like he's going to be Justin Jefferson.
In his weekly Steelers chat, our Steelers insider Brian Bacco was asked about Mason Rudolph no fewer than 3 times. I saw Sports Illustrated writing about how there's a new quarterback controversy in Pittsburgh, and it's Mason Rudolph versus Mitch Trubisky at the number 2 spot. Paul I don't get. I think we've talked about this at least a couple of times on the show, but the enduring sudden love for Mason Rudolph as soon as Mitch Trubisky showed up in town is something I don't get, and I don't know if I ever will.
Yeah, I mean, I don't either. I mean, Mitch Trubisky it's funny, but he is sort of the guy that is now sort of taken on the role of either people love him and think that he's, still the number 2 or 3 overall pick or whatever he was, and that there's a superstar quarterback, just waiting to take over, or they think he's a total scrub and they want him out of town. And, that role used to be reserved for Mason Rudolph. But Rudolph has sort of now become the sympathetic figure in some ways. I really believe that. Where people believe, well, maybe he didn't get he didn't get the right opportunities and all this other stuff. He's also a guy who has handled himself the right way. You know, and let's face it, we love the backup quarterback, right? We love the backup quarterback, especially the backup quarterback that's never going to play a minute of any game ever this entire season. Those are the guys we fantasize about, and those are the guys that we love and say, wow, you know, he's got, you know, a big arm, and of course he threw a really good pass against Tampa, you know, for a touchdown, that really deep pass he threw. You know, everybody's like loses their mind because you only get to see them a little bit in the preseason, and usually against the other team's bad players. So, but it's funny how the whole thing with Mason Rudolph has sort of like completely changed when it's now pretty clear that he's no threat to Kenny Pickett and he's no threat to the starting quarterback job. He has become a little bit of a folk hero. As for the budding controversy, I don't even know what that means. I mean, they obviously want to keep three quarterbacks because they can now. They obviously had a plan to say, well, in terms of a third string quarterback, we could do a lot worse than Mason Rudolph. So I think that's still the plan. I don't know that I've seen anything that would change my mind.
Yeah, I agree, and I think Mitch Trubisky has taken on the unpopular QB1 properties with, you know, no one wants to criticize Kenny Pickett in this town because he's Kenny Pickett. So they project all of the dissatisfaction at quarterback onto Mitch Trubisky. You know, I think that's part of the phenomenon here, Paul. Last question for you on the Steelers is, can we stop talking about Kendrick Green playing fullback? Like, I feel like it's one of those storylines that only creeps up after a bunch of reporters have been forced to watch 30 plus hours of football practice, which, listen, sometimes interesting things happen in football practice, Paul, and it's good when people are there to see them. But there's a lot of other times when you watch football practice, you do not have a trained enough eye to see much of anything. And it's like, I feel like that's one of those things where, oh, here's something different. Kendrick Green at fullback. Let's talk about that. Do you have any, I mean, are you under any illusion that this guy can make the team as like the second or third fullback?
We're talking about keeping two halfbacks, two running backs. If they keep a second fullback, it would be, and I guess if you technically want to call Connor Hayward a fullback, technically they might, but I shouldn't say zero. But I'll put it this way. There's almost zero chance Kendrick Green is on this roster as a fullback. I can't imagine they're going to take a roster spot up for Kendrick Green to be a fullback. And let's be very, very clear. The guy can't play offensive line. He cannot play offensive line in the NFL. He's not big enough. He's not good enough. We saw it again last week when he gave him a little bit of opportunity to play. This thing about him playing fullback, reading some of these guys that were covering it, I thought, as I tweeted out, this might be the second coming of Christian Okoye, according to what some of these guys are saying. But, you know, at the end of the day, I don't know if the Steelers are trying to showcase him and help him out for another team, maybe, you know, that might need a fullback or whatever. But I agree with you, Adam. And I very fully expect that Kendrick Green's time with the Steelers is about 2 weeks longer, and he'll be, you know, whenever they start announcing cuts, he'll be in that group among the first ones cut.
Paul, I want to move on to some spicy Pirates topics. We've got Austin Hedges, Quinn Priester talk coming up. But before we do, just want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors at Pella Windows and Doors of Pittsburgh. There's no better place to get new windows and doors installed in your home than Pella, who can help you save on energy costs year-round. Schedule a free in-home consultation with your local Pella Windows and Doors to find the right product for your home and budget. Give them a call at 866-593-1560 to discuss your project further. That's 866-593-1560 to get started planning on your new windows and doors installation with Pella Windows and Doors of Pittsburgh, who sponsors all of our PG Sports and Now YouTube content where we're talking about the Steelers. With that, Paul, let's get into these Austin Hedges comments. He was fired up on a podcast with Chris Rose about getting booed in Pittsburgh for hitting 160 for long stretches of time. And I tweeted this, Paul. I said it really shows you how far an athlete can go in today's day and age by being polite in interview settings, that there's anyone who wants to talk to a guy who hit 160 for the Pittsburgh Pirates and got traded for beans 2 weeks ago, that there's an audience for hearing from that guy's grievances with the fan. Can you believe we're still talking about this guy, Paul?
No, and here's the thing. If you listen to what he had to say, he's completely delusional. He's out of his mind, okay? If he doesn't understand why he was booed here in Pittsburgh, he's like, oh, well, they're trying to make it out like it was my fault. Well, it wasn't your fault that the team was bad, but it was your fault that you batted 160 and you were generally useless at the plate almost every single game you played here. But the fact that, as you're aptly pointed out, somebody wants to talk to this guy who is, basically what I would call a journeyman, baseball, journeyman major league player who is hitting, I think he's actually hitting worse since he's been traded, is incredible. These guys they get it, but they act like they don't get it. He knows full well why he was booed. He knows full well why he deserved to be booed. And so, but if you're right, he found somebody that's sympathetic that wanted to talk to him, and so he went all. But I really just wish we could erase Austin Hedges from our memories and never talk about him again, because to me, it produced some of the most mind-numbingly stupid discussions that we've had over the course of time were about Austin Hedges. Be it, his defensive runs saved versus his pitch framing versus why the Pirates needed him to have him in the lineup, even when he's like in an 0 for 25 slump, to everything else involved. I'm so happy that he's gone, but I just wish that we would never hear from him again. And this was absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, I like I said, I just can't believe we're still talking about him. So, let's move on. Let's talk about some other things. Quinn Priester it's the latest Pirates youngster, piece of the future, to be sent unceremoniously back to the minor leagues. He joins Mitch Keller last year. He joins Roansy Contreras and Luis Ortiz this year. Paul, at a certain point, doesn't someone have to be held accountable for the fact that these guys keep coming to the major leagues not prepared? And I hear people, like, the thing that I can't understand is I see people tweeting, oh, man, that Neil Huntington, look at his last draft picks. He really stunk at drafting, didn't he? Quinn Priester has been developed in this regime for 4 years, Paul. He was picked at the extreme tail end of the Neil Huntington era. And the idea that you should just forgive Ben Cherington for not being able to develop a guy who has, he's had 95% of his development under his watch, that we shouldn't hold this front office accountable because it was drafted by a previous front office, is truly one of the dumbest things I've ever
heard. I think that here's Adam, I cannot understand how you can have so many guys on this team that are young guys that have been in the system for 2 or 3 years that are so seemingly woefully unprepared to play in the major leagues. And it speaks 100% to the development. It speaks, and I know we're going to talk about my column about Shelton, but forget about Shelton for a minute, okay? How about all of the minor league instructors? How about the guys that are the bench coaches? How about the guys who are the ones that are most responsible for developing these players? They're not getting it done. And, Quinn Priester, whatever you want to, and I've heard people say, oh, his stuff isn't good and this and that, and he only throws at 90 miles an hour and, all that other stuff. Listen, obviously when he was drafted, he was considered a very high level prospect because of his stuff. And you don't have to throw the ball 103 miles an hour to be somebody who's got good stuff. The fact that he's not better developed as a pitcher as somebody who can, change speeds and use his breaking stuff and keep the ball in good locations and do all the stuff that, the craftier guys that don't have the 103-mile-an-hour arms do to have 15-year major league careers or whatever. Guess what? The fact that he doesn't have correct. You can tell me I'm wrong, but watching him pitch, it looks like he has none of that in his arsenal. He's just throwing baseballs at the catcher's mitt and hoping that they get past the batter. I didn't see any evidence that he was really good at changing speeds. He was really good at hitting spots. He was really good at having an approach and changing locations and using, certain pitches to get strikeouts. I saw no evidence of that. And I don't blame him for that. I blame whoever developed him for that. Now, maybe I'm wrong, Adam. Maybe I'm being too hard on the guy and too hard but you tell me, am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. And I'll add this, Paul. When you were watching those first 3 innings of his debut where he kept inducing ground balls, you were watching the broadcast. You thought they were talking about prime Charlie Morton and how great. Oh, look at these ground balls he's inducing. Like we were watching a magician.
Right.
Like if that's the bar for the guy you picked in the first round of the 2019 draft is, oh man, he's really great at inducing ground balls. Like this kid could work. And then we've seen with that philosophy. We're talking in baseball terms as it existed 10 years ago. Like, Pittsburgh loves to talk about things that worked 10 years ago in baseball, and that the game has evolved, Paul.
Right.
Like the game has evolved, and I think that's part of what, when he was inducing those ground balls, I felt like I was getting flashbacks to 2013. Like people figured that out, right?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that's part of the problem. It's just sort of the tone deafness of it all. And the fact that, and I understand broadcasters that are hired by the team have to say certain things, but to me, I just laugh. I laugh when, we're basically supposed to think certain developments mean, this shows they're doing the right things. Actually, no, it shows that they're doing the wrong things, and they're not teaching these young pitchers how to pitch. I mean, it should be alarming, like you said. Ortiz, right? Contreras, like what the hell happened to him? Priester up and back down. It should be alarming to people that these young players that are coming up that we keep talking about as the foundation for the future, that many of them don't look like they're prepared to play in the major leagues. And then you wonder, okay, well, what the hell were you doing with them down there for 2 or 3 years or however long you had them?
Well, I think Mitch Keller belongs in that conversation, Paul, because he was demoted last year. And, people talked about his first half this season like it was a triumph of the Pirates' development. He got bombed for 3 years. Right. If that's the bar that we're going to hold all of those guys you just mentioned to, then when's this window of success coming? If those guys are all going to be terrible for 3 years before they figure it out, if that's what it takes for this Pirates front office to develop these guys and get them to access the talent that they have, I think that's a terrible sign. So I also want to get into Derek Shelton. You mentioned you wrote a column saying he should be coaching for his job. I wanted to ask you specifically why he should be coaching for his job, and what he's responsible for in what we've seen from these young players this season. Because listen, he gets the guys that get delivered to him. He can only work with the guys once they've gone through years of development. How much can you blame him versus how much can you blame the development regime and those minor league coaches?
Oh, and I'll tell you what, real quickly, I forgot. Speaking of, broadcasters saying ridiculous things and lowering the bar. Yesterday I heard on the I think it was on the pregame show, one of the guys say, the thing that has really led to this Pirates burst over 25 games has been Reynolds and whatever. And he's and I'm thinking to myself, over the last 25 games, they were 13 and 12. So I mean, if that's a burst, but anyway, here's my thing about Shelton. Okay, eventually results have to matter. And I'm not saying that he has been dealt a really fair hand, but I've seen enough from him in terms of some of the decisions he makes with pitching changes, some of the decisions he makes with lineups, some of the stubbornness he's shown to stick with certain players and things of the such. Some of the idea, where he's beholden to pulling guys out of games just because, well, that's the formula we set up before the game, as opposed to, well, this is the way that there's enough that I've seen from him that to me suggests that he is not helping the team. And so, he might not be the reason they're losing, but he's not helping them either. And after 4 years, 4 years of 100 loss, actually this won't be a 100 loss season. It'll probably be like a 90 loss season. But still, to me, and if it's not a 90 loss season, then we've got real issues. I mean, if it's, 95, 96, I think you fire the guy. I don't know how you bring him back. If it's 90, okay, 90 would be what, 72 and 90? Is that the number? It's a 10-game improvement. I would say basically start him off next season, but let him know that, hey, if it goes south early, you're gone. But to me, I think at some point results have to matter when you're a coach. And yeah, you know what? It's not all his fault, but who hired Oscar Marin? Who hired, what's his name, Andy Haynes or whatever his name is? Who hired these guys? At some point the buck has to stop here. So my point is, the last 6 weeks of this season, if this team goes in the tank, right? And I mean really goes in the tank, what does that suggest about him? You got young guys that are hungry, that are trying to win games, and they're fighting. If your team goes in the tank, are you really the guy to lead them next year? I don't think you are.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair, Paul. I also wanted to wrap up here on some college football talk. Pitt and Penn State were both in the AP poll. Penn State was ranked number 7. Pitt was in the receiving votes category. Do you think those are fair rankings for both teams? And do you think they set expectations where they should be? Or do you think, I think especially in Pitt's case, I think Penn State is pretty close to the ceiling, Paul. But in terms of Pitt, do you think that they deserved a little bit more respect after the last 2 seasons? Or is it just a function of they lost some really good guys, and even if there's some potential there for Pat Narduzzi, they haven't proven it, with some of these guys coming in?
Well, let me just start with Penn State. Is Michigan and Ohio State ranked they're ranked in the top 5, right?
They're 2 and 3.
Yeah. So basically, they're saying Penn State's the 3rd best team in the Big Ten again. And I think that's fair, probably. I mean, it's not to say that Penn State couldn't beat Michigan or Ohio State, but I kind of feel like, they're probably going to lose to at least one of them. So, it's probably a fair place. I think by the end of the year, they'll finish it. They'll be 5, 6, 7. Because I think really, if you look at their schedule, the only games they're in danger of losing are probably Ohio State and Michigan. They're going to beat everybody else. Pitt's interesting. One of the things about Pitt is they've lost so much talent on defense. And the other part of it is people watch Phil Dracovic play against Boston College. I mean, for Boston College in a terrible offensive line. He got hit. He got beat up. People forget he was a pretty good quarterback at one point. So in Pitt's system with Pitt's line, he's probably going to be better. But I kind of understand that as somebody who's voted, for a lot of years, I kind of understand why Pitt isn't getting quite as much love, because when you're a sports writer in, Norman, Oklahoma, right, and you're probably picking up like Lindy's Magazine or whatever. Oh, Pitt's losing, 7 starters on defense. They've got this quarterback from Boston College. You know what I mean? I can see it happening like that. I do think Pitt will be a top 25 team this year, though. I think their defense will be better than people think, because I think Pat Narduzzi's recruited really well there. And I also think that Phil Dracovic will be fine. The offense will be fine. I have them at like 9 and 3, Adam. So I don't think they're being disrespected, but I do think that eventually they will be a top 25 team.
You think they can be 3rd in the ACC, Paul?
3rd might be a little aggressive. 4th or 5th, definitely. I think 7th is ridiculous, or wherever they were picked. But I think, I think they'll probably finish about 4th or 5th in the ACC, be about 9 and 3. I think that'll be a great season.
Yeah, I think that would be in continued momentum. And I think, Paul, if you can pull off 9 and 3, you're like maybe one game in record wise in terms of being in a serious playoff conversation come, 2024,
Right.
because you're going to have 12 teams in, and if you can be that second, third best team in the ACC, I think you're going to be on the fringes, just given that the SEC and the Big Ten are probably going to get at least 3 teams each. But you're in the conversation, and for Pitt, I think that's a significant step forward for where they've been for the last quarter of a century. So I think 9-3 does exactly what you needed to do to set yourself up for 2024 to maybe be in the mix to really make some national noise. Paul, any final thoughts before we sign off here?
Nope. I gotta run, so let's do it again next week.
Let's wrap it up. All right. Well, we'll talk to Paul again next week. And just a reminder, make sure you subscribe. Check out the North Shore Drive with Christopher Carter on Friday. And otherwise, we'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check out our Apple Podcast channel for more podcast content. Click below for a special deal of 99 cents for a 3-month subscription to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette.